Good afternoon, everyone. It's 3 minutes past the hour, and we'd really like for you to get the very best of the rich data that we're sharing today with Black Sands and Stack data. But before we get there, let me just start by introducing myself. I'm Sikwit Pamudi. I am the Program Director of the New Economy Hub. We're an initiative of the African Climate Foundation where we work with campaigners, researchers, community leaders, and decision makers to win the policy strategies and social benefits that assure us a more sustainable future. As I'm sure we're all aware, we are faced by this ecological calamity that is really beginning to distress not just our climate and our biodiversity and the livability of the planet, but more immediately, we also know that and can see that it's really impacting on infrastructure and our economies, and most importantly, the lives and livelihoods of the people of South Africa and the world all over. And so we really exist here to try and work together with these collaborators in an ecosystem kind of approach to shape a new sustainable net zero economy that can assure us or secure us a livable planet and a more fair, just, and equitable economy. Now, just before I hand over to my colleagues from Black Science and Stack Data, I just want to very briefly give you an overview of who we are and what we do. We are, as it says on the label, the New Economy Hub. We initiated the work that we do last year, and we had a really great soft launch at COP, but we'll be continuing to present ourselves and present our work and what we hope to offer the context in South Africa all through this year as we really firm up our place and our presence in South Africa where we work. Well, what do we exist to do? Well, ultimately, we exist to support campaigners, researchers, decision makers, and decision influencers. Here, I really mean communities who really care about what is happening with the ecology and its implications for the economy. To really campaign for a more sustainable future for ourselves here in South Africa. Our vision is that South Africa ultimately implements a successful transition towards a decarbonized economy that's powered by an equitable energy system, unlike the one that we currently have in many respects, and that energy system is anchored in renewables. This is not simply for its own sake or for the sake of an abstract economy, but that it really should do work, and that work should be to deliver and distribute these economic and social benefits that mitigate inequality, unemployment, and poverty in our country, as well as by enhancing the delivery of public goods and services. So we're really thinking about how can we leverage the energy transition at the narrow level, but the broader transition that we have to do across systems, across various levels of how the economy is structured, and most significantly, how society and the political economy around it is structured, so that we can be able to have a just and fair economy. Our mission, or at least what do we bring to this big, lofty vision that all of us have to do some work in contributing to? Well, it's really to build, support, and amplify this authentic social demand that already exists for the concrete development pathways that can take us there, right? So this is why we are working with researchers, campaigners, policymakers, decision makers, and influencers and communities to really be able to co-create the new economy that we're calling for. Now, we have three key strategic priorities in order to be able to do this, and I think that these will resonate for many of us coming from South Africa, certainly, but some of you who are joining us from abroad. The first and most significant is really supporting us to have one coherent conversation around the climate emergency, what needs to be done to address it, both at the level of mitigation and adaptation, and what we then need to do at the level of policy and mobilization and deployment of climate finance, the billions and trillions that we need to transform our economies. And it's really about us having a common conversation, common understandings, and all of it being driven by or underpinned by good evidence, so that we're not having a fragmented conversation that is vulnerable to hijacking by the kind of polarizing views and perspectives and interests even that would not like to see the work towards transitioning our energy system and transitioning our economy overall moving as quickly as we would need to. The second is as supporting transition-affected communities at the hyperlocal level, as well as at the national level, to be better prepared and better empowered to participate in the development planning that is going to affect them directly and is happening in their backyards. We're ultimately saying that communities need to build up the evidence that they can see, that they have direct knowledge of, in order to bring it into the spaces in which these decisions are being made with an equal sense of agency and power in terms of shaping those decision-making forums, so that we can have outcomes that deliver locally led and place-based development. Thirdly, we'd like to see transition-affected communities having an enhanced capability to launch and land the campaigns that can win us the new economy. And here, it's really about providing technical support and various tools and resources that enable them to really shape the narrative, to shape the dialogue in ways that resonate with their context and that respond to their context and where they would like to be. And certainly, this webinar is just one of those technical supports that we're offering, particularly because of the richness of the evidence that it offers that relates to South Africa. Now, ultimately, a new economy needs new narratives. And in South Africa, because of our so-called triple challenge of structural and racialized inequality, unemployment, and poverty, we really need to launch at this in ways that respond to these issues. And this is really about narratives that drive green, decent jobs that we know an energy system that is powered by renewables, and in fact, an economy that is powered by renewables can deliver if we make the investments and we take the necessary and urgent action that we must, in order not just to save the ecology, but to really strengthen and build resilience around our economy. The second is around ending energy poverty. We live in this unusual state of affairs in South Africa where, in spite of having among the highest levels of electrification in the continent, so many people proportionately cannot access or even afford energy. And so we're really needing to address this issue of how do we deliver cheap, clean, and reliable energy to communities so that they can then also enjoy the benefits, the economic and social benefits that being plugged in to the grid should and do deliver. And last, it's really about getting the enhanced climate financing that we need to pay for all of this. As we know, South Africa is faced with inordinate amounts of debt. We have a serious revenue problem, and significantly, there's issues around how do we manage or approach the developmental investments that we make that can then deliver the high growth that is equitably distributed to support our economy to work for the many and not just for the few. And so here we're saying we need to be looking at how climate finance is managed in South Africa, but also how climate finance is drawn down from the global financial system as it currently stands, including perhaps even, including, of course, reorganizing the structure of the global financial system itself so that it is more fair and more equitable to those of us who belong to the majority world, unlike what it currently is at the moment. And so this is really the work that we hope to do, and this is really how we hope to contribute to the conversation, the climate conversation, engagements and activism that is happening in South Africa. Now, as we know, it's a mega election year across the world. South Africa is going to the polls towards the midpoint of the year for what is set to be a watershed election year. Many are touting it as the most significant since 30 years ago when we went to the polls for the first time. More than 60 other countries across the world are also going to the polls, dealing with very much the similar kinds of issues as we are. How do we respond to the climate emergency? How do we respond to structural and growing inequality, unemployment, poverty? How do we manage the impacts of neoliberal capitalism for our economies in ways that can enable us to then transform how we do the economy? And so without much further ado, I'd like to hand over to Carrie Watson from Black Sands Communications, who will then introduce the folks who are really going to present this amazing work that we've had the fabulous opportunity to be involved in developing around what are people thinking in South Africa around climate, how do we connect these issues to the electoral mandate, and where could we take this? So Carrie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, with huge thanks to the team for coordinating this event. We're incredibly grateful and very excited to be here today to launch the Money Talks research in South Africa. I'm Carrie Watson. I'm part of the Black Sands Communications team. Black Sands is a small consultancy working in communications and campaigning strategy for positive impact. I'll be kicking off the presentation, and my colleague Liz, co-founder of Black Sands Communications, will also be taking you through more of the presentation shortly. We're also joined by our colleagues at Stack Data Strategy, Marina and Tuan, who'll be presenting some of the insights. Stack are industry-leading experts in data strategy and analysis, and we work closely with the team on the Money Talks research. So we have around 25 to 30 minutes of presenting, and then we'll be entering a Q&A. So please, as we go, do feel free to add any questions into the Q&A function of the Zoom, and we'll make sure to run through these later on. Next slide, please, Liz. Great. So why now? As this group will know, we need our global leaders to speed up and scale up investment in action on climate change and development. And this will only happen if the public are in support of ambitious action. So we need to identify the most effective ways to help people to understand this complex issue. And crucially, we need to go beyond the bubble. So our messages need to reach vital, influential audiences. And this research project, Money Talks, can help us to do just that. So at the end of last year, we had the global results launched from Money Talks and shared insights from across the 15 countries that we surveyed. And today we'll be focused on South Africa, sharing key audience insights and strategic recommendations for how to communicate around this agenda in order to win support and drive impact. And this is the second year of the Money Talks research. So in 2022, we surveyed the G7, and in 2023, we expanded the reach of the survey to include Australia and 7 emerging economies that you can see listed here, including South Africa. The fieldwork was done in August in both years, in 2023, surveying 30,000 respondents across these 15 countries. And a quick note on our methodology. So for the survey, we conducted 2,000 interviews in each country, including South Africa. All interviews were conducted online, and responses were weighted against the national census for age, gender, education, and region variables. And election results for past political voting behaviour. And surveys were thoroughly checked, including for bot responses, to ensure that we had a really high quality sample. And then we also conducted focus groups in South Africa. So we conducted 3 90-minute focus groups in South Africa with 8 participants in each group. Each group focused on a different segment from the Living Standard measure, with participants spanning levels 4 to 10 of the LSM. So that's a brief overview. For now, I'll pause there and I'll pass this to the Stack team to kick off with concerns in context.
Great, thanks. Hi, so yeah, to first kind of understand how we can communicate about issues of climate and development, we really wanted to understand these issues in the context of wider concerns in South Africa and globally. So if you could go to the next slide. The first thing we asked is when people are voting, what issues are they most concerned with and what kind of influences their vote most? So we found some interesting differences in the G7 plus and the emerging economies. The G7 plus was much more focused on one issue, and that was cost of living. So 45% of individuals in G7 plus said when they're voting, cost of living is their biggest concern. That was followed by healthcare, climate change was third, then the state of the economy. Whereas in emerging economies, it was much more widespread, but more focused on economic everyday issues. So unemployment was the most kind of largest concern, followed by corruption, the state of economy, and then cost of living, with climate change not being in the top 5 for emerging economies. However, if you then look at globally for the top 5, climate change does come in at number 5. However, cost of living is still the major issue across all countries, followed by the state of economy, healthcare, and unemployment. So once again, we're seeing here that climate change starts to get drowned out by other issues, which is really important to know when we're trying to think about how we best communicate issues of climate and development. And maybe it is kind of tying it in with these other day-to-day issues, such as cost of living and unemployment, et cetera. So if we look at South Africa in specific, we can see that these issues are very much kind of tied in, and climate change is lost in the shuffle. So first we have unemployment, followed by corruption and cost of living, and then 10th we have climate change. This was validated by our focus groups. So when we asked what people were concerned with, people cited things such as prices, corruption, load shedding, and crime. But then when we followed up and asked about climate change, there is still a lot of concern, which we'll see following up when we kind of expand it to just about climate change. So if you look, we asked, how concerned are you on a scale of 1 to 10 about issues related to climate change? South Africa was our second most concerned nation, which is really interesting. So there are a lot of dominating issues, but that doesn't mean South Africans aren't extremely concerned about climate change. This was also found once again in the focus groups where people said they were really concerned, they want their government to be doing more. There was just more concerning issues that are kind of invading their day-to-day that they have to care about a little bit more. So really interesting that we still have these really high levels of concern. Another thing is we can see, yeah, that's in terms of last year to this year, we did see some movement towards people are a little bit less concerned than they were last year in the G7. However, we didn't test South Africa last year, so it will be really interesting to see next year potentially what direction South Africa moves in the election. There's a lot of issues on the table. So very interesting, but the concern level is still very high. There's just a lot of other issues on the plate. I'll hand it over to Tuan now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Marina. Yeah, so Marina talked about how people perceive this issue in the context of other issues. Now let's zoom in more on kind of climate action specifically and how people perceive investment and spending around climate action. We did this in a couple of different ways. This is one. We gave people 3 statements and asked them to select the statement closest to their view. I'll go through the 3 statements very briefly. So the dark green statement is a very positive statement about climate change funding, saying climate change funding is an opportunity and good investment in our future. So these are people who selected that statement unreservedly support this type of funding. Light green is climate change funding is important, but it's also difficult in the short term. So perhaps slightly more reserved type of support for climate action investment. And finally, light blue is climate money used to fund initiatives to tackle climate change is another cost we cannot afford at the moment. So the statements are all deliberately priming, but priming in different directions. It's really interesting to see how this kind of works out all across the board. And we find that both in the G7 plus and the emerging economies, there is majority support for the 2 green options. So for the supportive options of climate investment and climate action, which is a really good sign for this. We also see that there is this group of about a quarter of the population in the G7 plus and about 20% in the emerging economies saying that climate change funding is a cost that we cannot afford at the moment. There are more pressing global issues. In South Africa, this, one last thing on the previous slide, this figure was more or less in line with the emerging economy average. So about 19% of South Africans as well said that climate change funding is a cost that we cannot afford at the moment. However, there's still majority support for the investment overall. Now, we also tested where people would prefer this kind of investment money to be spent and on what scale specifically. So again, we tested 3 different statements and asked people which one was closest to their view. The kind of global Scale spending statement was the light green one, saying that by investing in other countries, we can help them do their part in tackling climate change. See that about overall across all the countries that we studied, 34% of people put themselves in this bucket. The light blue statement is a more domestic spin on climate change spending, saying to tackle climate change, we should be spending money at home and not abroad. So specifically probing whether people think that maybe climate change funding is okay, but it should be spent in South Africa or in whatever country the respondent was living in. So we see overall that about 44% of people fit this bucket, and the dark green option is kind of outright opposition. We should not be spending money on tackling climate change at all. 13% of people on average fit in this bucket. Now the figures for South Africa are relatively similar to the pie chart here, which is the kind of global average. The only significant deviation is the light blue bucket. 50% of South Africans actually fall into this bucket, saying that to tackle climate change, we should be spending money at home, not abroad. So that's a really, I mean, that's half of the population, right? That's a really significant proportion of people who are leaning towards this kind of domestic angle on climate spending. This, I think, chimes well with the results from our focus groups that Marina outlined earlier. So really highlights this tension between, on the one hand, perhaps caring about climate change and recognizing it as an important issue, but on the other hand, seeing that there is this tension between with the more urgent pressing issues that are hurting the country right now and that are also, I mean, also cost significant amounts of money. So perhaps this is a kind of intermediary route where, you know, if we spend on climate change, at least spend it kind of in a way that benefits South Africans. If we move to the next slide, this is exactly the same statement, but just a visual from our dashboard to illustrate what we can do with that. So the dashboard is also available on the New Economy Hub website. We'll share the link later, I'm sure. But this is the little bar chart on the bottom right of your screen shows how this question that we just talked about breaks down by who people voted for in the 2019 South African elections. And there's some really interesting variation here. You can, you know, play around with this on the dashboard yourself if you want to, and select all kinds of different variables. But just to highlight one interesting one, if we look at these people who think that money on climate change should be spent at home in South Africa and not abroad, and we look at this by political party voting behavior, we see that Democratic Alliance voters are significantly more likely to hold this view. So from that group, 69% of people hold this view, whereas for the ANC voters and the Economic Freedom Fighters voters, this is only 43 and 48%. So it's significantly different, which means there are some interesting kind of political dynamics to explore here. I'll leave you to do that at your own leisure when you're exploring the dashboard. We can flick to the next slide now. We also tested support for some principles and policy ideas that are very much related to this topic. So on this slide, we tested agreement or overall support for the statement, high-income countries should bear a larger part of the cost of climate action than lower-income countries because they are historically responsible for more damage to the climate. Now, overall, across all countries that we studied, this generally people agreed with this. 69% overall, on average, agreed with this, with 9% disagreeing. In South Africa, the support for this statement was even higher at 81% agreement. So widespread support for this one. Just like for the one on the next slide, which is a more policy-oriented statement that we tested here. Here we specifically tested whether people would support making finance and loans more affordable for emerging economies if this helps them tackle climate change and improve health, education, and livelihoods. Again, overall across the board, there was 61% agreement, 12% disagreement. So that's solid majority support for the idea. In South Africa, this was even higher at 71%, perhaps reflecting that South Africa, or that people in South Africa realize that this is something that would benefit the country perhaps disproportionately. If we move to the next slide, so the last couple of things that we tested are related to trust in international cooperation on these issues. So we asked whether people would trust a specific set of countries to have the best interests of partner countries at heart when investing in lower income countries. So basically, which countries would you trust to help you out with these kind of major challenges like climate change? We find top of the list, the US, trusted by 36% of the public on average across all countries that we studied, followed by the UK and Canada at 29 and 28%. The bottom of the list was the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and China and Italy. Now, this is the list overall, but if we flick through the next slide, here you see all the countries that we presented on that list, and we asked people to choose between on your left, so all the way from the US to Italy, and then specific columns that show a different cross break of the data. So the all nations column is just the global average that I just read out. But if we look at who the G7 and Australia trust specifically, we see that yes, the US is still on top, and Canada and the UK are pretty high up. But trust in UAE and China is really, really low. And it's interesting when we compare that to the column all the way on the right of the table on the African nations. So just as a reminder, the 3 African countries that we studied are Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. And we see that the US here is definitely by far the number 1 on the list at 51%, followed by the UK at 40%. But what is really interesting is the 3rd spot is occupied by China at 38%. So this is a significant difference from the other cross break that we looked at, the G7 and Australia, where China is much more trusted as a partner in international cooperation. And also it should be noted that the UAE, United Arab Emirates, here just being an example of another potential partner, is also more trusted at 28%. Some really interesting differences to kind of talk about there as well. But with that, that is the main kind of headline findings from this part of the research. And I'll hand over to Liz for the next part.
Thank you, Tuan. So if there's one thing we really want you to take from this presentation is that the way we talk about investing in action matters. It can really impact how you win support, but you need to know who you're communicating with. But we've done some experiments here, essentially, that we're going to take you through. And in some cases, we've seen support increase by 20% just by changing the way we talk about things. So I think climate justice is a really interesting one. So here we ask people whether they felt they understand the term and whether they support it. And the light green is I understand it and I think it's important. The dark green, as you can see, is I understand it, but I don't have an opinion. Blue, I don't like it. Understand it, I don't like it. And white, I don't understand. And as you can see, South Africa follows the average for the emerging economies in that most people understand it and support it. And there's actually just this 20% here who don't have an opinion, and very small number who don't understand it. But for G7 plus, it's quite different. Climate justice, you've only got a third of people that really think they understand it and support it, and actually the other 2/3 either don't understand, don't care, or don't like it. So if you're talking about climate justice, and this is important, I think, for you guys in South Africa, if you are trying to communicate to persuade maybe that G7 finance minister or someone else in the G7, what works in your country isn't necessarily going to be the best message for engaging in another country. And this chart just brings it to life a bit more. So this is the top and the bottom of the scale. So if you're doing a campaign in Kenya, climate justice is obviously a really good way to go. 73% support there and only 6% not liking it. But in Japan, right, more than half of people just don't even understand it, let alone be able to support it or not support it. So it would be a really heavy lift if you were communicating to Japan. So in 2022, we ran a version of this research, which was G7 only. And through that research, we did an audience segmentation, which we updated in the 2023 research. And what we found here is we've got this group here, 16% called anxious globalists. So these are people who understand these issues, who are highly politically engaged. And I would hazard a guess that all of you people on the call, if you work with colleagues in other organizations, national organizations or international NGOs who are from G7, they probably fall into this category. Now, they are a very important group because they're very active, but politically, they already know what they think. They're not persuadable. They already know how they're going to vote, probably. So what the research identified was these 2 dark green segments. So these are the mainstream middle, and they're very interesting because they are persuadable on these issues. They do care about climate change. They're open to investment in other countries than their own. And they're effectively swing voters. They are centre-right and centre-left. So politicians really need to message to these people in G7 countries. So again, if your communications need to have an impact in G7, you need to have a think about who you need to message to. The anxious globalists may well already be on your side, very important, but the politicians you're trying to persuade, they need to think about these swing voters over here in the middle. Now, the good news is we're going to give you a whole bunch of insights and suggestions on how to communicate based on the research, and they work particularly well for these mainstream middle audiences, and actually even some of the further right audiences. So we tried to boil it down into 6 comms tactics to get us out of the bubble. And by the bubble, we mean the sort of group of NGOs and individuals that are always working on this issue. So tactic 1, I know this sounds obvious, but start with what they care about. So in the G7 plus, cost of living, we've already talked about that. For South Africa, unemployment, corruption, and cost of living. So can you make the connection with what people care about and link that to climate change and to development issues, inequality, and so on? These things are top of mind. And this is another grab from the dashboard, which you can spend a very happy hour or 2 exploring. You can explore it by demographic, ethnicity, age. Here we're looking at past vote. And this question was, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? I would like to see the government do more to attract investment in green industries such as renewable energy and sustainable farming that will create jobs in South Africa. And as you can see, we've got South Africa result here, high support, net agree 86%, and across political parties. And I actually had a look at this by age, ethnicity, gender, and it was just high across the board. That's a real winner for you guys. We also wanted to test where people thought government spending should go. We want to look at what people thought about nature. And so we asked people where they think their government should be spending more. And cost of living comes out top. So 53% as an average across the 15 countries and 70% for South Africa. So really important to try and link the issues you're working on to the cost of living. But what's interesting here is nature comes second above climate change. So 50% overall and 63% in South Africa. So it'd be really interesting to think about how can you use nature as a route to open the door. And certainly in some of the G7 modelling we've done, nature is particularly a good route in for some of those harder to reach audiences, and definitely the mainstream middle. And down here, aid to poorer countries is very low. As we know, we all want to change that conversation and be, how do we talk about investment rather than aid? So we asked this question. We asked people to imagine a global fund was established, and not necessarily government money. But we asked people to imagine there was a global fund that actually had enough money to tackle climate change and poverty and inequality. And we asked what they would be excited about. And there was a lot of agreement across the board here. So G7 plus, clean water, hunger, fighting disease. And on the right here, you've got the emerging economies. And what's interesting is these sort of more immediate needs came top, and the longer term things, tackling deforestation, building infrastructure and so on, were seen as less exciting. And South Africa, again, it's the same story. Number 1, green jobs. That was the most exciting thing. So again, how do we actually talk about this thing? I don't know what the conversation is like in South Africa, but certainly in the UK where I am, I think if you talk about investing in climate change, people have some kind of idea of, a wind turbine or a solar panel. They don't understand that it might be about flood defences or agriculture, and they probably haven't thought about it. It's creating jobs, reducing poverty, and might be reducing hunger. Really encourage you to think about how to make those connections. So tactic 4, win-wins work. So we asked this question. Please imagine that your government has put forward a plan to invest $10 million in a lower income country. And we split the sample, and half got the top question. This project will support sustainable farming and food production. Sorry, statement, not question. And then the others got the treatment, where we added, this would allow them to export food to your country more reliably and at a lower cost. And these were the results. So as you can see, if you add that extra sentence that clearly shows a tangible benefit back to the home country, it increases support. and quite dramatically in some cases. So Canada up is 20%, but it's really positive in South Africa, 15%. Kenya was a bit of a funny one. It showed strong support for both proposals actually, but less for the treatment, for what we think are issues, about the national conversation there. But yes, 15%. We need to think like political parties. If you're a political party and you knew by messaging something it would increase support by 15%, you would do it. So again, just to show how the dashboard works here, this is looking at past vote again, and you can see this green bar here shows the impact of using that win-win phrase. And what you can see here is it has much more impact with the Democratic Alliance than, say, the economic freedom fighters. So that gives you a sense of who it's going to be most effective with. What we found in many of the other countries, that it was age. It's less true in South Africa, but it was age. So the younger people agreed with both statements. You kind of don't need to win their supports, but the older, probably more conservative audiences, for example, in G7, the treatment, the impact support really made a big difference. So 9% overall, 15% increase in South Africa. We did ask another question about gave people a range of different win-win scenarios and asked them what they thought one would be most convincing. And the two that came top were reducing forced migration and improving food security. And I would say food has been a key theme both in 22 and 23 as being something that across the world works really well to engage people if you're linking it to food. Tactic 5, make polluters pay. So this was a really interesting one because they had 73% of responders supporting this concept globally, and even more in South Africa. It does vary per country, and interestingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, the more polluted the country, the more people agree. We are actually just currently looking at doing some more research to look at other kinds of taxes and how to message them, which will be coming up later in the year. And we're hoping that we can include South Africa in that polling as well. Tactic 6, trillions and billions don't work. So we often talk about the big sums of money that we need to solve all this stuff, but it just, it's too big sometimes for people to get their head around. So we asked this question. To tackle the climate crisis and reduce global poverty, people have argued that we would need X of additional funding and investment worldwide. Would you support or oppose this campaign? And we gave people these 4 options: 2.4 trillion, 2 to 3% of global GDP, 2 to 3% of global GDP, equivalent to what we spend on military and defense, or whatever it takes. And here were the results. So communicating as a percentage of global GDP increased support by average of 7%. I don't think it has to be just a percentage of global GDP. It's about giving people a meaningful comparison to give your audience context. Most people don't, these sums are too hard to compute. In some countries, changing that framing increased support by, up to 20%. And in South Africa, it increased support by 10%. But interesting, there was also high support for whatever it takes. And you can see here with this little diagram, the countries below the line, the comparison to defence worked slightly better than just the percentage of GDP. But, think about other comparisons and think carefully if you're talking about big numbers. You need to make it meaningful for people. And finally, as you all know, it's not just about what we say, but it's the messenger and the channels and so on that are really important. So we asked people who their trusted climate messengers were. And you can see the top 5 here. This was similar for South Africa. So scientists, people still saying that's good news that they are trusted. That does vary by country. So interesting results when you look at Trump versus Biden supporters in the US, where Trump supporters trust friends and family far more highly than others when it comes to these sorts of issues. Interesting as well, the victims of climate disaster are here. We'd love to do more testing around this. I do think that people are motivated by what's close to home. So if you can show people who have experienced climate weather disasters who are from the community or a close by community, I'm sure that would have a big effect. Didn't test that though. Least trusted climate messengers, you can see local government is in there, and activists. So we found in the 22 report that G7 mainstream audiences don't like partisan voices or activist language. You know, Greta Thunberg is not the right person to convince them. And this is perhaps supported by the 23 research here. So, in conclusion, we've got a list of don'ts and do's for you, which I'm not going to read out because we've just done it in the presentation, but we will make this presentation available for you alongside the dashboard, which you can have a play with and you can share with your colleagues. It's a resource for the movement. Please use it. Please ask us questions as well. The dashboard we mentioned, if it's not already linked in the chat, I'm sure it will be shortly. And finally, just to leave you with a thought, overall, we can get it can feel hard campaigning on this stuff, right? But let's not forget, the majority of people across all 15 countries care about climate change and support investment in action on climate and development. So I will leave it there. We have lots more information we could share, but that's enough for now. And I think we'll be open to questions.
Thanks, Liz. I think so far just one question from Sandy and another from Fiona, actually. First question from Sandy was around wondering if we tested reactions and awareness around the just energy transition in South Africa. We didn't specifically, did we, on this research?
No, we didn't. So with so many things we could test, I'd love to test loss and damage as well, but no, that wasn't part of this research.
And then a quick question from Fiona, was there the option for media in the messengers question?
So we tested news and journalists of who was trusted, and they came out 5th in the global kind of test, and then also 5th in South Africa behind. So scientists, environmental organizations, victims of climate disasters, renewable energy companies, and then news and journalists were 5th most trusted in South Africa.
Thanks, Marina. Question from Anita, will you be presenting this data to politicians? Question maybe for Liz.
Well, so in terms of South Africa, we don't have the networks to present to politicians, but we are here and happy to support however you are. So if there's an opportunity to do briefings, presentations, we would be happy to help.
Great. Thanks, Liz. Any further questions from the group? It's a lot of information to take in, so we've perhaps stunned you to silence.
Well, I think everyone knows where we are. How are corporates rated? Well, we had fossil fuel companies. What else do we have in there, Marina?
Yeah, I think fossil fuel companies was the major corporation, and they were 2nd least trusted in South Africa, so very untrusted.
But we didn't test. It's always the question, isn't it, when you're setting up these polls, how many options do you give people so that you can actually get a response? So other corporates weren't on the list in this particular case. Do have a dig into the dashboard because it's amazing and really useful. And also we are here, you know where we are, and we're here and happy to do further presentations for your stakeholders and answer any questions. Should we hand back to Secretary now? There's no further questions?
Great, fantastic. Well, really, thanks so much to the team. I think we've really gotten a bit of an earful and a headful of data from the colleagues at Black Sands and Stack. So I just want to really, well, firstly, just run over just some of the key points that I drew from the presentation, but also just from fooling around with the dashboard over a couple of days. I think the first thing is that, yes, for the South African electorate, the climate emergency as an issue, distinct from others, is fairly low down the line in the range of big issues that we are dealing with, a lot of which are structural and developmental in nature. But nevertheless, most at least the polling data indicates that most South Africans actually do care a great deal about climate change and do care a great deal about the government taking climate action. And out of that, I think that we can really start to get some direction around how we might be able to do our messaging to leverage those sentiments in order to move us in a direction where there isn't a distinction between climate action and development action, but rather these are synonymous. They mean the same thing. The second thing I think here is that we, particularly for those of us who are communicators and campaigners, it's really critical that we ground the messages that we deploy around taking climate action in the issues that people care the most about in South Africa. And I don't think it's too far a stretch to make those linkages both directly as well as indirectly. Certainly on the aspects on unemployment, certainly on the aspects of the cost of living, which is so impacted by our energy insecurity crisis in the country. And so, you know, addressing energy insecurity with the rapid deployment of relatively cheaper and quite reliable renewable energy technologies in communities that stand to be most directly affected by the energy transition, particularly in our energy heartland of Mpumalanga. Right there, we can start to demonstrate that these technologies can reduce the cost of living and can also start to lead the way in terms of developing the kinds of skills and industries that can absorb people in those communities into new jobs and into more sustainable lives and livelihoods beyond the formal economy as well. And so I'd really like to just leave you with that for the time being. I'd like to encourage you to please play with the data on the dashboard. There are a few, the presentation is also on the page right at the bottom, and there are also a few tiles that you can download and share and distribute with friends, with your communities, both online, and also you're welcome to print those and distribute them as the case may be. But beyond this, I'd really just like to thank everyone for joining us. It's been a fantastic session, and I'm really so grateful that you gave us your time to engage with this data. I'd also really like to thank the team from Black Sands, Liz, Carrie, for the fantastic collaboration and the work that you've done. And I'd also really love to thank the team from Stack. That's Twan and Marina for the very detailed and careful work you've done in polling, getting us a representative polling sample, and also just making sure that the data stacked up. So thank you so much, everyone. We've got 10 minutes to go, and I'm very happy to share that back to you. I should also like to thank our colleagues at ACF in the comms department who have really helped us to kind of organize all of this and make it work and get the comms to you. If you have any further inquiries, please reach out to us at inquiries@neweconomyhub.org, and we'll be very happy to connect you to all the relevant people and answer what questions that we can. But beyond that, really, please get in touch with us, connect with us. We hope to make these sessions all the more regular, and we hope to have you here with us sharing in the knowledge, sharing in the resources that we come into or that we co-create with our partners. So thanks once again. Be well.
Thanks. Bye. Bye all.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.